Production of Swan Song is supported by viewers like you. Thank you. What comes to your mind if I say the words SD Gundam? For a lot of Western gamers, SD Gundam is a name that has a strong negative connotation, and at a glance, it's easy to understand why. There's an absolute ton of SD Gundam games on about every imaginable platform. Hell, the Virtual Boy's only licensed game in its entire Japanese library is an SD Gundam game. I'm not kidding when I say there are probably SD Gundam games for multiple consoles you've never heard of before. They're that thorough. Gamers in the West also got conditioned in the mid to late 90s to think that games based on licensed properties are absolutely going to be awful thanks to masterpieces like Superman 64. And if you knew enough about Gundam to know that SD Gundam was a super deformed spin-off of the main series, or you had played another series' super deformed spin-off games, then you'd probably assume that a game based on a super deformed spin-off would likely be an inferior, less polished version of the games featuring the mainline franchise. Through Western eyes, faced by a language barrier, we struggled to understand how SD Gundam could be good, so we built a framework out of generalizations so we could dismiss it as a collection of cheaply made trash. Then we ran around for years telling all our friends that SD Gundam was bad. And when you think about it, what people think about SD Gundam is not far off from what people think about the WonderSwan's entire game library. In both cases, when I'm playing and evaluating them myself, I'm left wondering, how many people actually sat down and tried to play these games? The more I research and I play SD Gundam games, the less I find myself agreeing with the Western gamer perception of them, and the more I want to tell people how cool these games actually are. So on this episode, we're taking a look at the 69th and final WonderSwan release for 1999, SD Gundam Gashapon Senki Episode 1, developed by Graphic Research, published by Bandai, and released on December 29th, 1999. As I covered in the episode about SD Gundam Emotional Jam, SD, or Super Deformed Gundam, was born out of a need for a simplified art style that could be used in capsule toy merchandise for both readability and ease of manufacturing. But this art style also performed double duty, as they were much more easily converted to readable pixel art on lower resolution gaming platforms. Until the Sega Saturn and PlayStation showed up, mainline Gundam games featuring the original, more intricate robot designs were the exception and not the rule on home consoles. This led to the creation of the SD Gundam Gashapon Senki series on the Famicom and Famicom Disk System. SD Gundam Gashapon Senki Scramble Wars, the first game in the series, was an iconic turn-based strategy game for the Famicom Disk System. The first two games in the series were labeled as part of the action simulation genre. These play like turn-based strategy games, but combat is resolved through an action game sequence where the player controls the unit directly. More on this later. Gashapon Senki 3 and 4 would move away from the action simulation genre, and instead combat would cut to something closely resembling a Final Fantasy battle screen, with actions picked from menus and no real-time action whatsoever. Gashapon Senki 5 is essentially a completely different kind of game, playing more like the board game Risk, with squadrons of ships and robots fighting to control territory both on Earth and in outer space, and it featured impressive battle cinematics for the Famicom back in late 1992. All of this series feels very experimental, and with good reason. Gashapon Senki as a series predates Famicom Wars by a year, and Fire Emblem, which would set the template for turn-based strategy genre on consoles, by almost 3 years. Not only did this series contribute to the industry's collective experimentation with the genre, but it established a lot of ideas that would become mainstays of subsequent SD Gundam SRPGs, ultimately leading to the birth of the massively successful SD Gundam G Generation series on the original PlayStation, which continues to exist today. Even though Scramble Wars can feel quite odd when viewed through modern expectations of what turn-based strategy games should play like today, it's remembered quite fondly by people who grew up with it, and it's one of the few licensed video games that still sees re-releases through initiatives like the Famicom Mini line of games on the Game Boy Advance, or the Virtual Console on the Wii and 3DS. In 1992, the action simulation style of gameplay from the first two Gashapon Senki games returned on the Super Famicom. SD Gundam X, SD Gundam GX, and SD Gundam G Next were released between 1992 and 1995 for fans of that style of gameplay, but this time allowing impressive battles with up to 7 units battling in an action sequence at once instead of 2. These games all look incredibly fun to play. In 1997, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Scramble Wars, Bandai once again returned to the action simulation style of gameplay with SD Gundam G Century on the PlayStation, and this one was an absolute stinker. Bandai still hadn't mastered how to load things properly on the PlayStation, so each time you went in and out of combat, you'd always see the same loading screen with the same 2 lines of character dialogue, and they were unreasonably long. The battle sequences had sluggish controls and felt completely unresponsive. I mean, there were a bunch of bugs and balance issues and AI issues too, but fundamentally the game was frustrating to play even without those. And that leads nicely into the WonderSwan game that we are covering this episode. SD Gundam Gashapon Senki. Gashapon Senki marks the first return of action simulation gameplay to the SD Gundam franchise since G Century. It plays most similarly to the first 2 Famicom Gashapon Senki games. Think of it like a turn-based strategy like Advance Wars. Units make their way across a map to capture the opposing base. Along the way you can capture cities, which can repair units and generate more cash for you, or factories, which can spawn new units. Each faction has about 10 units they can build, each with varying build times between 1 and 3 turns. Once you enter a battle, you enter an action minigame where your unit fights the opponents one-on-one. Prior to entering combat, you can choose whether you want to control the unit yourself or if you want to let the CPU control it for you. For some reason, this reminded me of auto battle modes in modern mobile games, which can sometimes help you in a pinch if you're playing a game on the go and you need to briefly deal with real-life things like not missing your bus stop. Each unit has 3 weapons available, with most units having a beam saber mapped to a beam rifle mapped to B, and a special weapon, which is usually missiles, activated while pressing both A and B, but the weaponry can vary depending on the unit. The game is rather short with only 10 maps to play on, but it does introduce more units and more varied terrain types, with different properties later in the game. Also, if you've got a buddy with a WonderSwan and a copy of the game and a link cable, you can face off head-to-head in the versus link mode. Unlike modern-day SD Gundam games, which are primarily simulation RPGs with units that gain experience points and can be upgraded over the course of a playthrough, this game is purely turn-based strategy, where the only resource that carries over from one map to the next is your remaining cash. So I had a pretty fun time playing this game. It's not a spectacular game, but it's pretty serviceable and has just enough novelty to be interesting as a curiosity. Even though it only has 10 maps, I think that this is the perfect length for the depth this game has. It's a nice little gaming snack. I've played some other SD Gundam strategy games in the past and I'm used to them having brutal AIs, so I was surprised to see how dumb the AI is in this game by comparison. As long as you capture as many cities as you can, you should be able to crank out more powerful units more quickly than your opponent and overwhelm them that way. Shockingly, there isn't really any story in this game, and it's nowhere as text-heavy as other mech strategy games on the system. There aren't that many menus to navigate either, as a lot of the need for menus is removed by automatically engaging certain game actions when the unit is moved onto an enemy unit or a capturable space. There are no lists of weapons or attacks to choose from, as battles occur in real time. This makes it a relatively easy game for people who are unable to read Japanese to play through if they're curious about this kind of SD Gundam game. I think the action simulation genre was a really neat idea Bandai had, and I wish they had expanded on it more. One of the running issues I've had with most mech games on the WonderSwan thus far has been the length of battle animations, which you've rarely been able to disable. Making the battles interactive just really helps mask how long the battle sequence takes, and I would really recommend using manual operation over auto if possible. Yeah, the controls in this game are a little bit janky at times, but you can get used to them with a little time. As far as I can tell, they only made one other game in the genre after this one, SD Gundam Gashapon Wars in 2005 on the GameCube, which they later re-released on the Wii in 2010. Playing this really got me in the mood to go check out the Famicom and Super Famicom games because they seem like they've got a ton of love poured into them. I've only touched the surface of the SD Gundam iceberg in this episode, but I hope I've made a compelling case that despite what you may have heard previously, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on throughout this franchise. I know it's daunting to approach if you aren't a Gundam fan, I know it's daunting if you can't read Japanese, and I know it's probably hard to care if you aren't a turn-based strategy nut. But we can do better than hand-wave away this franchise because we don't understand it. And I'm not saying this to shame or mock anybody who has said that in the past because I was just as guilty. I set out to better understand the Gundam franchise because I knew it was important to telling the story of the WonderSwan properly. Over 10% of the system's library consists of games with Gundam in their name or featuring them as playable units. Slowly but surely I'm becoming more of a Gundam fan and deepening my appreciation for the older games in the SD Gundam franchise. This episode isn't here just to end 1999 in a nice poetic way. It's also trying to make up for the lackluster treatment I've given past Gundam and Super Robot Wars games in the series. I've learned from my mistake, and now I hope everyone else can learn too.